Jack Whitmore had built a life surrounded by wealth but filled with silence. After years of loss and solitude, he had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that his pristine, empty mansion was all he deserved. But one winter night, everything changed. A desperate knock at the door. A young girl named Emily, clutching two frail children in her arms, stood shivering on his doorstep. She carried more than just the weight of her siblings. She carried a story of heartbreak, survival, and an unspoken past that would force Jack to confront the life he thought he had buried forever. Why was Emily so afraid to look back? Who was she running from? And what buried truths would Jack uncover as he fought to protect this fragile family? The mansion was quiet, wrapped in the muffled stillness that only came with snow. Jack Whitmore sat alone at the long mahogany dining table. A half-finished glass of wine sat beside a plate of roasted vegetables and seared chicken. The meal had been meticulously prepared, but barely touched. Jack's gaze was distant, fixed on the empty chair across from him, the chair that no one had sat in for years. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Jack exhaled and adjusted his silverware, his movements precise. He was a man who valued order, perhaps because it was the only thing he could control. His house was spotless, every corner arranged to perfection, yet it felt cold, sterile, even. He had built this life alone after losing everything that had once mattered. The sudden knock at the front door jolted Jack from his thoughts. He frowned. No one ever came unannounced, especially in weather like this. When the knock came again, louder and more insistent, he pushed back his chair and stood. His footsteps echoed in the wide hall as he made his way to the front door. The moment he opened it, icy wind rushed past him, biting through the warmth of the house. Standing on the porch was a young girl, no older than 12. Her face was pale, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. She clutched two small children, an infant boy and a toddler girl, wrapped in mismatched blankets. "Please," she whispered, her voice thin and trembling. "I need help." Jack's heart thudded in his chest as his eyes moved from the girl's hollow face to the children she carried. Their small faces were damp with sweat despite the cold, their breathing shallow. The girl's arms shook from the weight she carried, but she held them tightly, as though letting go would break them. "Come inside," Jack said, stepping aside. She hesitated for a second before stumbling into the foyer. The warmth of the house closed around her, but she didn't seem to feel it. She laid the children gently on the sleek leather couch, then swayed on her feet. Jack moved quickly, guiding her to a nearby chair. "Sit," he ordered, disappearing down the hall. When he returned, he carried a thick blanket and a medical kit. He draped the blanket over her and knelt beside the couch, his mind switching to a familiar mode, assessing, calculating, fixing. He checked their pulses, felt their foreheads, and gently pulled back the blankets. Their fevers were high, but there was no sign of rash or injury. "How long have they been like this?" Jack asked. The girl's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. "Since yesterday," she whispered. They wouldn't stop crying. Then they got quiet. Her voice broke on the last word. Jack measured their temperatures with a quick, practiced motion. His brow furrowed. "They're dehydrated. They need fluids and rest. Their fevers will break once I treat the inflammation." He stood abruptly, heading toward the kitchen. The girl watched him with wide eyes, like a startled deer. When he returned, he held a small bottle filled with an electrolyte solution. "Give them small sips," he instructed. Her hands shook as she took the bottle. "Thank you," she said softly. Jack nodded and resumed his work. After ensuring the children were stable, he stood and faced her again. "You need to rest too," he said. "There is a guest room upstairs." The girl blinked at him, her face etched with exhaustion. Slowly, she nodded. For the first time since she had arrived, she smiled, a fragile, fleeting thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What is your name?" Jack asked gently. "Emily," she answered. That's Luke? And Lily? Jack nodded. I am Jack Whitmore. Emily's shoulders sagged as though the weight of the world was finally lifting. Her eyes fluttered closed, and within seconds she was asleep. Jack watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with something he couldn't quite name. The house was no longer silent. For the first time in years, the cold emptiness had been replaced by the soft sound of breathing by life. Jack turned back to the children. He adjusted the blankets, his hands moving with surprising gentleness. As he watched their small chests rise and fall, he felt something shift deep inside him. It was faint, but it was there, a flicker of something warm and unfamiliar. Responsibility. He brushed it aside. This wasn't personal, it couldn't be. He was only doing what anyone should do. Yet as he glanced toward the door, snow still falling thickly outside, he knew this night would change everything. Jack took one last look at the girl, now curled up in the chair, and the children sleeping soundly on the couch. With a deep breath, he picked up the scattered medical supplies and returned them to the cabinet. In the back of his mind, a question lingered. Who are you, Emily? And how did you end up here, at my doorstep? But those questions could wait. For now, he had a job to do. Jack turned out the hall light and returned to the couch, keeping watch over the children as the storm raged on outside. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The first rays of morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting soft golden streaks across the polished floors. The mansion was quiet, except for the faint crackling of the fire Jack had kept burning through the night. He had barely slept, his mind restless with questions. Jack sat in the leather armchair near the couch, his eyes fixed on the small forms of Luke and Lily. The boy stirred, letting out a soft whimper before settling again. Jack leaned forward and gently adjusted the blanket over him. A soft rustling sound made Jack look up. Emily was awake, her wide brown eyes blinking in the morning light. She sat up slowly, rubbing her arms. For a second she looked disoriented, like she wasn't sure where she was. Then, as her gaze landed on her siblings, the tension in her face eased. "Morning," Jack greeted, his voice low but steady. Emily's eyes flicked to him. "Morning," she whispered. Jack stood and walked to the couch, checking Luke's temperature. It had dropped overnight, a good sign. He noted the improvement with quiet relief. Lily was still sleeping, her small fist curled near her cheek. Emily watched Jack closely. Are they okay?" Jack nodded. "The fevers are down. They just need food, rest, and time." He paused. "You too." Emily hugged her arms to her chest. "I am fine," she muttered. Jack knelt down so he was at eye level with her. "You don't look fine," he said, his tone matter of fact, but not unkind. "When was the last time you ate?" Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Yesterday morning, I think." Jack sighed and stood. "Come with me," he said. Emily glanced at the sleeping children, her protective instincts kicking in. "They will be fine for a few minutes," Jack assured her. "You need to take care of yourself if you're going to help them." Reluctantly, Emily stood and followed Jack to the kitchen. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself as they passed through the spacious dining room, her eyes briefly lingering on the long, empty table. Jack opened the fridge and pulled out some eggs, milk, and bread. "Do you like French toast?" he asked as he cracked the eggs into a bowl. Emily nodded, but didn't say anything. She perched on the edge of a chair, watching Jack whisk the ingredients together. "You didn't tell me your last name," Jack said, his tone casual but probing. "Ellis," Emily answered quietly. "Emily Ellis." Jack froze for the briefest moment. Ellis. The name tugged at something buried deep in his memory, but he shook it off for now. He focused on flipping the slices of bread in the skillet, letting the warm scent of cinnamon and butter fill the room. "You live around here?" Jack asked, keeping his voice even. Emily shook her head. "No, we lived in a small town a few hours away. After she trailed off, biting her lip, Jack set the finished plate of French toast in front of her and sat down across the table. "After what?" he asked gently. Emily hesitated, then looked down at her plate. "After my mom died," she whispered. "She got sick after the twins were born. She tried to take care of us, but—" Her voice cracked, and she took a shaky breath. "She couldn't. After she passed, we stayed with my stepfather. He wasn't kind." Jack's stomach twisted. He didn't press her for details. He had seen enough in her eyes to know the truth. "So, you left," he said. Emily nodded. "I had to. He was getting worse. And the twins. They were too little to understand. I tried to keep them quiet, to keep him calm, but—" Her voice broke again. "I had to protect them." Jack leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from Emily made it feel personal in a way he hadn't expected. "You did the right thing," Jack said firmly. Emily's eyes shimmered with tears. "I didn't know where to go," she admitted. "We've been walking for hours before we got here. I thought no one would help us." Jack's chest felt tight. "You knocked on the right door," he said simply. For the first time, Emily let out a small, shaky laugh. "I guess I did." Jack stood and refilled her glass of water. "You're safe now," he said. Emily took a sip of water and nodded, though there was still hesitation in her eyes. She was a girl who had learned that safety was fragile, fleeting. "You can stay as long as you need," Jack added. "We'll figure things out." Emily blinked up at him, surprised. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. Jack paused, considering his answer. "Because someone should," he said at last. Emily studied him for a moment, then looked down at her plate, cutting another piece of French toast. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack nodded and cleared his own throat, brushing away the strange warmth that her quiet gratitude stirred. "Finish your breakfast," he said. "Then you can check on the twins." Emily smiled faintly as she ate, each bite slow and deliberate, as though she didn't quite believe it was real. For the first time in days, her stomach felt full, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the faintest hint of hope. When they returned to the living room, Luke stirred, his little face scrunching up before relaxing again. Lily's small hand twitched in her sleep. Emily knelt by the couch, gently stroking their heads. Jack watched her from a distance, his heart heavy with unspoken questions. The name Ellis echoed in his mind like a distant bell. He would need to know more, but not yet. For now, he would give her what she needed most: warmth, stability, and time. And maybe, just maybe, they would both begin to heal. The snowstorm had passed, leaving behind a world draped in white. Sunlight streamed through the windows, reflecting off the frost-tipped panes. Jack stood in the living room, his arms crossed as he watched Emily kneeling beside the couch, gently brushing hair from Lily's small face. The girl was so tender with her siblings, her fingers moving with practiced care. "They look better," Emily said quietly, as though afraid to jinx it. Jack nodded. "They're getting stronger." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and guarded hope. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack hesitated. He had spent years living in solitude, wrapped up in his work and his memories. Responsibility was something he had buried along with his past. And yet, standing here, seeing the way Emily clung to her siblings as if they were her whole world, he couldn't walk away. "We take it one step at a time," Jack said at last. "Right now, that means making sure all of you stay warm, fed, and rested." Emily blinked, clearly taken aback by his calm certainty. "Do you want to help me make lunch?" Jack asked, more as a way to ease her nerves than out of necessity. She nodded after a moment, standing slowly as if unsure if her legs would hold her. Jack led her back to the kitchen, where the smell of cinnamon from breakfast still lingered. He pulled out a loaf of bread, some deli meat, and a block of cheese. "Sandwiches," Jack announced, setting the ingredients on the counter. Emily gave him a small smile, the second one he had seen since she arrived. "I can handle that," she said, stepping forward and picking up a knife. She sliced the bread with careful precision while Jack filled a pot with water to make soup. As they worked, the silence between them began to feel less heavy, more like an unspoken truce. Jack glanced at Emily as she stacked slices of ham and cheese. She moved methodically, though there was an edge of nervousness in her posture. "You've done this a lot, haven't you?" Jack asked. Emily shrugged. "I've been cooking for Luke and Lily since Mom got too sick to do it herself." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "She used to hum while she made lunch. I tried to copy her, but it never felt the same." Jack stirred the pot, his throat tight. "You were doing your best," he said. "That's what matters." Emily didn't respond right away. When she spoke, her voice was small. "I didn't do enough." Jack turned to face her. "You kept them safe. You got them out. That's more than most people your age could have managed." His tone was firm but kind. Emily's eyes shimmered, but she blinked quickly and focused on the sandwich in front of her. Jack gave her the space to process his words. Instead of pushing, he ladled soup into bowls and set them on the table. "Sit," he said, nodding to her. Emily hesitated, but eventually sank into the chair. She reached for the glass of water Jack placed in front of her and took a long sip before picking up her sandwich. Jack sat across from her, watching as she took small, cautious bites. She was still tense, but there was something different in her, now a glimmer of trust beginning to take root. Between bites, Emily asked, "Where did you learn to do this?" She gestured to the soup and sandwiches. Jack smiled faintly. "My mother used to make me help in the kitchen when I was a kid." She said cooking taught discipline and patience. His smile faded slightly. "I didn't understand that until much later." Emily tilted her head. "Where is she now?" Jack paused, surprised by the question. "She passed away several years ago," he said quietly. "She and we didn't always see eye to eye." Emily nodded, as if she understood that more than most would. "Neither did me and my stepfather," she muttered. The room fell silent again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jack watched as Emily finished her food and leaned back in her chair, looking more at ease than she had all morning. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Jack said suddenly. The words surprised him as much as they did her. "You and the twins. I have plenty of space." Emily looked at him, startled. "Why?" Jack leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Because I can help, and because no one should have to do what you did alone." Emily's throat tightened. She had expected indifference, or maybe pity. But kindness? It felt foreign and fragile, like something that could shatter if she reached for it too quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack gave a small nod. "One step at a time," he repeated. The sound of a soft cry drifted from the living room. Emily shot up from her chair, already moving before Jack could react. By the time he reached the couch, Emily was holding Luke, gently rocking him in her arms. Jack stood nearby, his arms crossed. "He is lucky to have you," he said softly. Emily looked down at Luke's sleepy face and smiled, a real smile this time. "No," she said, "I am lucky to have them." Jack felt something shift inside him, a quiet realization that the girl who had appeared on his doorstep wasn't just running away from something terrible. She was fighting for something precious. As Luke's whimpering quieted, Jack's gaze softened. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "we should figure out what comes next." Emily looked at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Jack hesitated, then spoke carefully. "We need to figure out how to keep you safe, all of you." Emily's face tensed. "He'll come after us," she whispered. "He won't stop." Jack's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure he cannot." Emily's breath caught. Jack's words weren't a promise, they were a declaration, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt the stirrings of something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the wide windows, casting a warm glow over the living room. Luke and Lily were asleep again, wrapped snugly in soft blankets. Emily sat on the couch, absent-mindedly stroking Lily's curls, while Jack gathered a few extra pillows. He had tried to keep things normal, whatever normal could look like, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Emily had been quiet ever since their conversation in the kitchen. Jack knew the weight of her fear. The idea that her stepfather might come after them wasn't a distant possibility in her mind, it was a certainty. "You don't need to keep looking over your shoulder," Jack said gently as he set a pillow near her. "You are safe here." Emily's eyes darted to the door, lingering there for a second too long. "I've thought that before," she murmured. Jack opened his mouth to respond when the loud, sudden knock echoed through the house. The sound cut through the calm like a blade. Emily froze, her face draining of color. Jack's entire body tensed. He exchanged a quick glance with Emily, and the fear in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "Stay here," Jack said, his voice low but firm. Emily clutched Lily tighter. "Jack, I've got this," he assured her. "Take the twins upstairs and lock the door." She hesitated but obeyed, gently lifting Luke into her other arm and retreating toward the stairs. Jack waited until she was out of sight before turning back toward the door. The knock came again, harder this time. Jack's footsteps were slow but deliberate as he walked to the door and pulled it open. The man standing on the porch was exactly who Jack had feared. He was broad-shouldered and unkempt, his coat wrinkled and stained. His eyes were bloodshot, his face flushed from the cold or from rage. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. The man sneered. "You, Jack Whitmore?" Jack crossed his arms. "I am." The man's eyes narrowed. "Where is Emily?" Jack didn't move. "She is safe." The man stepped forward, his breath puffing in the cold air. "She's my responsibility. My house, my rules. She belongs with me." Jack's grip on the edge of the door frame tightened until his knuckles turned white. "She is not your property. She is not going anywhere with you." The man's face twisted with fury. "Listen, Doc," he snarled. "You don't know anything about us. That girl is ungrateful, and those kids? They are just a drain. She needs to come home and face reality." Jack took a deliberate step forward, forcing the man to step back. "The only reality here is that you hurt her. She told me everything. And if you think you can walk in here and threaten her again, you are wrong." The man's bravado faltered for a brief second before he stepped forward again and shoved Jack in the chest. The force made Jack stumble, but not fall. He had spent years controlling his temper, and he wouldn't lose it now, not in front of someone like this. "That's assault," Jack said flatly, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I suggest you leave before you make things worse for yourself." The man's eyes darted from Jack's phone to the house behind him, searching for a way to regain control. "You think calling the cops scares me?" he spat. "She'll come crawling back." "They always do." Jack's patience finally snapped. "She is not coming back to you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Ever." Behind Jack, the faint creak of the stairs made him glance over his shoulder. Emily stood at the edge of the hallway, her face pale but resolute. Lily was balanced on her hip, and her gaze met Jack's before shifting to the man on the porch. "No," Emily said, her voice trembling but clear. "He is right. I am not coming back." The man's smirk returned as he spread his arms wide. "You really think you're free, kid? You don't have anywhere else to go." Jack took another step forward, blocking the man's view of Emily. "She does now." At that moment, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance, drawing closer. The man's eyes widened slightly, his bravado slipping. "I called them before I opened the door," Jack said, his voice steady. "This ends now." The man's sneer turned into a bitter scowl. "This isn't over," he muttered. Jack didn't flinch. "Yes, it is." The police car pulled into the driveway, and two officers stepped out. They approached the porch with calm authority, taking in the scene. "Is this the man?" one officer asked Jack. Jack nodded. "He came here to harass my guests. Emily can explain everything." The man's protests began immediately, loud and defensive, but the officers moved quickly. Within moments, he was handcuffed and led to the patrol car, his angry shouts muffled by the closing door. Jack exhaled slowly as the car drove away, the last echoes of chaos fading into the distance. He closed the door and turned to see Emily still standing by the stairs, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. "It is over," Jack said softly. "He can't hurt you anymore." Emily's shoulders trembled as she hugged Lily close. Slowly, she sank down onto the last step, the weight of everything finally breaking through her defenses. A sob escaped her, raw and quiet. Jack crossed the room and knelt in front of her. Gently, he reached for Lily and set her down in the bassinet nearby. When he turned back, Emily didn't pull away as he rested a steady hand on her shoulder. She leaned forward, pressing her face against his chest as sobs racked her small frame. Jack held her, his grip firm and reassuring as the storm inside her slowly calmed. "Thank you," she whispered through her tears. Jack's throat tightened. "You are safe now," he said. "You and the twins. I won't let anyone hurt you again." The house grew quiet once more, but this time the stillness felt different. It wasn't the silence of loneliness or fear, it was the calm that followed after a long battle had finally ended. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the mansion's snow-covered lawn. Inside, the quiet hum of the heater and the soft patter of footsteps filled the space. Jack stood at the kitchen counter, stirring a pot of oatmeal, while the smell of cinnamon drifted through the air. In the dining room, Emily sat at the table, her arms wrapped protectively around Luke as he dozed on her shoulder. Lily sat in a high chair Jack had bought the day before, giggling softly as she tried to grab the spoon Jack had handed her. The room was warmer than it had been in years, filled with something Jack had almost forgotten: life. "Breakfast is ready," Jack announced, bringing over the bowls. He set one in front of Emily and another in front of Lily, who babbled excitedly. Emily gave him a tired but grateful smile. "You did not have to do all this." Jack sat down across from her, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "You have been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. It is my turn now." Emily blinked at him, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. She shifted Luke to her other arm and took a small bite of oatmeal. She chewed slowly, as if savoring it, though Jack could tell she was still getting used to the idea that someone else was taking care of her. "You are good at this," she said suddenly, her voice soft. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Good at what?" "Taking care of people." Jack's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I did not think I would ever have the chance to be," he admitted. Emily tilted her head. "Why?" Jack took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "I have been alone for a long time. I got used to it." Emily's gaze softened. "I thought I could handle being alone too, but I could not really." She looked down at her siblings, her fingers brushing lightly over Luke's hair. "They are all I have." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "I know what that feels like." He paused, then added, "But you are not alone anymore." Emily's throat tightened, but she nodded. "It still feels strange," she admitted. "Being here, not having to look over my shoulder." Jack leaned forward, his voice steady but gentle. "It will take time, but you can let your guard down here. No one will hurt you or the twins ever again." Emily's eyes shimmered, but she quickly blinked back her tears and focused on feeding Lily, who was eagerly reaching for another spoonful of oatmeal. After breakfast, Jack gathered the empty bowls and placed them in the sink. Emily stood to help, but Jack waved her off. "Go sit with the twins. I have this." Emily hesitated, but obeyed, returning to the living room where she laid Luke down on the couch and tucked a blanket around him. Jack finished tidying the kitchen and walked back to find her sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Lily, watching the toddler play with a soft toy Jack had pulled from storage. "You mentioned you like reading," Jack said suddenly, remembering something she had told him the day before. Emily looked up, surprised. "Yeah, I love books. My mom used to read to me all the time when I was little. After she got sick, I read to the twins instead." Jack smiled faintly. "Come with me." Emily hesitated, but followed Jack down the hall to a large wooden door. Jack pushed it open, revealing a vast library filled with tall shelves and hundreds of books. Emily's eyes widened as she stepped inside, her gaze sweeping across the room. This is amazing," she whispered, awe in her voice. Jack gestured toward the shelves. "Help yourself. There is something here for everyone." Emily walked slowly along the rows of books, trailing her fingers over the spines. She stopped at a shelf filled with old children's stories and pulled out a worn copy of The Secret Garden. "My mom read this to me," she said softly, clutching the book to her chest. Jack's heart twisted at the wistful look in her eyes. He cleared his throat. "You can take it with you. Read it to the twins if you want." Emily nodded, her expression softening. "Thanks, Jack." Jack leaned against the doorframe, watching as Emily settled into one of the armchairs near the fireplace, opening the book to the first page. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked relaxed. The peaceful moment was interrupted by a soft knock. Jack turned to see Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who came by a few times a month, standing in the doorway. "I saw the lights on and thought I would check in," Mrs. Henderson said, with a warm smile. She noticed Emily and the twins and arched an eyebrow. Jack gave her a quick nod. "Some guests will be staying for a while." Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened as she took in the sight of Emily curled up with the book and the twins bundled in blankets. She smiled gently. "Well, it looks like they are right where they belong." Jack's chest tightened at her words. He had not thought of it that way, but somehow it felt true. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson," Jack said. "I will call if I need anything." The housekeeper nodded and left quietly, leaving Jack to return to the library. Emily glanced up, her brow furrowed. "Is that your housekeeper?" Jack nodded. "She stops by now and then to help me keep the place in order, but I think she could tell things are a little different now." Emily gave a small, shy smile. "Different, in a good way." Jack crossed the room and sat down in the chair opposite hers. The fire crackled between them, filling the quiet space with warmth. "I meant what I said earlier," Jack told her. "You are not alone anymore. You and the twins have a place here." Emily's grip on the book tightened. For a long time she had built her life on survival, never trusting anyone outside of herself. But Jack's words, the calm steadiness of them, felt different. "Thanks, Jack," she whispered again, this time with more weight behind it. Jack gave her a quiet nod, knowing they were only at the beginning of something new, something fragile but real. And for the first time in years, Jack felt that the house was more than just walls and rooms. It was becoming a home. The afternoon passed quietly. The fire in the library crackled softly, and the weight of the storm that had brought Emily and the twins to Jack's door seemed to be fading into memory. Emily was curled up in the armchair, reading aloud from The Secret Garden. Her voice was calm, steady, even soothing. Luke sat beside her, his small body pressed against her arm, while Lily babbled happily, playing with the edges of the blanket draped over Emily's legs. Jack stood in the doorway, watching them. For a moment, the scene felt so normal it was almost surreal. A memory stirred faint but persistent. The sound of Emily's voice, the way her eyes lit up as she read, reminded him of someone he had not allowed himself to think about in years. Jack's gaze drifted to the silver locket Emily wore around her neck. It glinted in the firelight as she leaned forward to turn the page. The locket was simple, but familiar. Too familiar. "Emily," Jack said, his voice careful. Emily looked up, surprised by the sudden interruption. "Yeah?" Jack crossed the room and nodded toward the locket. "That necklace, where did you get it?" Emily's fingers instinctively brushed the small silver pendant. Her brow furrowed. "It was my mom's. She never took it off. She gave it to me before—" Emily's voice wavered, but she cleared her throat and continued. "Before she got too sick." Jack's chest tightened. "Did she ever tell you where it came from?" Emily shook her head. "No. She just said it was special, that it reminded her of someone she loved." Jack's heart thudded in his chest. He leaned against the mantel, trying to steady himself. "What was her name?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated, as though sensing the weight behind his question. "Hope. Hope Ellis." The name was like a punch to Jack's gut. Memories surged forward. Memories he had buried long ago. He could see her now. Hope standing in the garden of their old house, sunlight in her hair, laughter in her eyes. She had worn that same locket, the small inscription etched inside, though he hadn't needed to read it to know what it said. Jack forced himself to breathe, to stay calm despite the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Your mom?" Jack began, his voice tight. "Did she ever tell you about someone she knew? Someone named Jack?" Emily blinked, confused by the sudden shift. "No, she didn't talk much about her past." Her gaze sharpened. "Why?" Jack swallowed hard. "Because I knew her." He reached into the small drawer in the end table and pulled out a photograph, one he hadn't looked at in years. He handed it to Emily with slow, deliberate movements. Emily took the photo, her eyes widening as she stared at it. The woman in the picture was unmistakably her mother. Hope's smile was bright, carefree. She looked younger, but still exactly as Emily remembered. But it was the man standing beside her that made Emily's breath catch. "Jack, this is you," Emily whispered, looking up at him, her voice trembling. Jack nodded. "We were close," he said carefully. "A long time ago." He ran a hand through his hair, his voice lowering. "I had no idea she had a daughter, no idea she had you." Emily stared at the photograph for a long time before she finally asked, "What happened? Why didn't you stay with her?" Jack exhaled slowly, the weight of old wounds pressing down on him. "We were young. We had plans, dreams, but things fell apart. My mother—" Jack's jaw clenched. "She never approved of Hope. She wanted me to follow a different path. I thought Hope left because she wanted a new life. But I was wrong." He paused, his voice thick. "My mother forced her out of my life." Emily's eyes searched Jack's face, her expression wavering between disbelief and something deeper. "You really knew her?" Jack nodded. "I loved her." The admission came out raw, but he didn't hold it back. Emily looked down at the locket in her hand, tracing its edges. "She never told me any of this," she whispered. "Why didn't she say anything?" Jack's heart ached at the confusion in her voice. "Maybe she thought it would hurt too much," he said gently. "Or maybe she was trying to protect you." Emily's fingers tightened around the photograph. She didn't deserve what happened to her. She deserved better. "I know," Jack murmured. "If I had known, I would have done everything I could to protect her. And you." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, pressing her lips into a thin line. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jack knelt down so they were at eye level. "Because you deserve the truth, and I think you deserve to know who I really am." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "Emily, I think I might be your father." Emily's breath hitched. The room felt suddenly too quiet, too small. She stared at Jack, her mind struggling to catch up. "My father?" she whispered. Jack nodded slowly. "I need to be sure." He reached for a small DNA test kit he had ordered years ago as a precaution for medical emergencies. This will give us answers." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the test kit. Her emotions swirled fear, disbelief, and a flicker of something she didn't dare name. "You really think?" Jack's gaze was steady, unwavering. "I need to know," he said softly. "For you, for the twins, and for Hope." Emily's shoulders sagged under the weight of the revelation. After a long silence, she finally nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "If it means finding out the truth, okay." Jack exhaled, the smallest hint of relief in his expression. "We'll figure this out together," he promised. Emily clutched the locket tightly, her heart full of unanswered questions. She had spent so long feeling lost adrift without roots. Now, everything was shifting beneath her feet. But Jack's steady presence, his quiet determination, anchored her. And for the first time, Emily allowed herself to hope that the answers she found might lead her not to more pain, but to a family. The next morning, the mansion was quiet, except for the soft patter of snow against the windows. The fire had burned low, and the first light of dawn spread across the frost-covered glass. Jack sat alone at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The DNA test kit sat unopened beside him. He had told Emily they would do it when she was ready, but the weight of the possibilities pressed on him like a stone. He felt the pull of old memories, the sound of Hope's laughter, the way her hand had fit so easily in his. And then came the darker memories, the years of silence, the growing void where their dreams had once lived. Jack ran a hand over his face, trying to shake the past loose. He had spent so long convincing himself that Hope was gone forever. Now, the idea that a part of her might still be here sitting in his living room was almost too much to comprehend. The quiet creak of the floorboards pulled him from his thoughts. Emily appeared in the doorway, wrapped in the oversized sweater he had given her. Her hair was slightly messy, and her eyes were tired, but there was a quiet determination in her face. "You're up early," Jack said, forcing his voice to sound normal. Emily gave a small shrug. "I couldn't sleep." She hesitated, then added, "I was thinking about everything." Jack nodded and gestured to the chair across from him. "Come sit." Emily padded over and sat down, her gaze drifting to the unopened test kit. She reached out and traced the edge of the box with her fingers. "Do you really think this will change things?" she asked quietly. Jack's brow furrowed. "Change what?" Emily looked up at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. "Everything. I mean, what if the test says you're not my dad? What happens then?" Jack leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "No matter what the results say, nothing changes what I want to do. You and the twins, you need someone. And I am here." Emily's throat tightened. "Even if—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jack's voice softened. "Even if— You're not alone anymore, Emily. I meant that." For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of Jack's words settling between them. Then Emily took a deep breath and reached for the test kit. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." Jack nodded and carefully opened the box. The test was simple, a quick swab of their mouths. Emily watched as Jack sealed the samples and set them aside to be sent off. It felt strangely anticlimactic, considering how much it could change. "That's it?" Emily asked, her voice almost bewildered. Jack gave a small smile. "That's it. Now we wait." Emily nodded and stood, pacing toward the window. She pressed her palm to the cold glass, staring out at the snow-covered garden. "It's strange," she murmured. Jack tilted his head. "What is?" "All of this," Emily said, her voice distant. "For so long I've had to do everything on my own. No one ever stepped in to help before." She paused, wrapping her arms around herself. "I didn't think people like you existed." Jack's chest tightened at her words. "People like me?" he asked gently. Emily turned, her eyes sad but honest. "People who care without asking for something back." Jack stood and crossed the room, stopping a respectful distance from her. "It shouldn't be rare," he said, "but I know that it is." He hesitated, then added, "You've spent so long surviving that you haven't had time to just live." Emily swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I don't even know how." Jack's voice was quiet but steady. "That's okay. You don't have to figure it out alone." Emily nodded, though she still looked unsure. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "What do we do now?" Jack glanced toward the living room, where the twins were still sleeping soundly. "We start small. Breakfast. A walk in the snow. Little things." Emily gave a faint smile. "That sounds nice." Jack nodded, sensing that she needed something normal to anchor her. "Come on, I'll show you something." Curious, Emily followed Jack down the hall to a small sunroom that overlooked the back garden. The glass walls were frosted at the edges, but the view was breathtaking. The snow-covered hedges and trees sparkled in the early morning light. "My mom loved this room," Jack said softly. "She used to sit in here and read for hours." He glanced at Emily. "I thought you might like it too." Emily stepped inside, her breath catching as she took it all in. "It's beautiful." Jack smiled. "Take your time. I'll go check on the twins." Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the snow outside. Jack left quietly, giving her space. Emily sat down in one of the cushioned chairs, the book she had brought resting on her lap. She stared out at the world beyond the glass, letting the stillness of the moment sink in. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no urgency, no need to run or hide. After a while, she opened the book and began to read aloud, her voice soft and steady. She wasn't sure when Jack returned, but when she glanced up, he was standing in the doorway, a cup of tea in his hand. "You okay?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Yeah." She hesitated, then added, "I think I will be." Jack gave her an encouraging smile. "That's a good start." The room fell into a companionable quiet as Jack pulled up a chair and sat beside her. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside, the warmth was undeniable. As Emily turned the next page, she felt something fragile but real beginning to take root, something that felt suspiciously like hope. 2 days passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. Emily settled into the sunroom more and more, finding solace in the soft light and the way the snow seemed to mute the world. Jack kept busy tending to the twins, making meals, and ensuring Emily felt as comfortable as possible. Despite their efforts to fill the time with small tasks, an unspoken tension hung between them, wrapped around the unopened envelope that arrived that morning. The DNA results. Jack had brought the envelope inside and set it on the dining room table without a word. It lay there like a weight neither of them dared to touch. Emily sat in the living room, cradling Lily, while Luke played with a set of blocks Jack had given him. She could feel Jack's presence behind her, watchful, waiting. Finally, she broke the silence. "Are you going to open it?" Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled as she adjusted Lily's blanket. Jack stepped into the room, his expression careful. "Not without you." Emily's breath hitched as she looked at the twins. They were everything to her, her whole world. She stood slowly, placing Lily down next to Luke, and turned to face Jack. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's do this." Jack nodded, and they moved to the dining room together. Emily stood at the table, staring at the envelope. Jack reached for it, and paused. "Are you sure?" Emily gave a small nod. "We need to know." Jack opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the paper with steady hands. His eyes scanned the page, and for a moment, his face was unreadable. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, his breath coming out in a long exhale. Emily felt her heart pound in her chest. What does it say?" Jack looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of relief and something deeper. "It's true," he said softly. "You're my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily's mind reeled as she tried to process what she had just heard. "My dad," she whispered, tasting the word as though it was foreign. Jack nodded, stepping closer. "Yes." His voice was hoarse with emotion. "You're mine." Emily's legs felt weak, and she gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. She shook her head slowly, tears welling in her eyes. Why didn't she tell me?" Jack's expression was pained. "I don't know. Maybe she thought it would hurt too much. Maybe she thought—" He swallowed hard. "Maybe she didn't think I deserved to know." Emily's breath shuddered as she wiped at her eyes. I thought he was my only option," she whispered, referring to her stepfather. "I thought I didn't have anyone else." Jack's heart ached at her words. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "You do now. You've always had me. You just didn't know it." Emily stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "But where were you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "When she was sick. When she needed someone. Where were you?" Jack's jaw tightened. "I didn't know," he said, his voice raw. "If I had, Emily, if I had known, I would have been there. For her. For you." Emily let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "You should have known." "I know," Jack said, his voice low. "You're right. I should have fought harder. I should have asked more questions. But I didn't." He took a deep breath. "And I've had to live with that for years." Emily's shoulders shook as she pressed her hands to her face. "I don't know how to feel." "You don't have to decide right now," Jack said gently. "Take all the time you need." Emily lowered her hands, her tear-streaked face filled with a mix of anger, grief, and something else. Something softer. "You're really my dad," she whispered again. Jack nodded, his heart in his throat. "I am." Emily's gaze drifted toward the living room, where Luke and Lily were still playing, unaware of the conversation. "What about them?" Jack followed her gaze, his eyes softening. "They're family too," he said. "They're not mine by blood, but they're yours. And that makes them mine." Emily bit her lip as more tears threatened to fall. "You mean that?" Jack knelt slightly so he could meet her gaze head-on. "Yes," he said firmly. "I want to be here. For you. For them. For all of it." Emily's defenses cracked at the sincerity in his voice. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay." Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Okay," he echoed, a small, hopeful smile breaking across his face. Emily let out a quiet, shaky laugh. "What do we even do now?" Jack straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. "We start small. Maybe lunch?" Emily laughed again, this time stronger. "Lunch sounds good." Jack smiled, relief washing over him. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. They walked together toward the kitchen, the unspoken weight between them feeling a little lighter. Jack grabbed a loaf of bread and some peanut butter while Emily found a knife. The simple act of preparing food felt almost therapeutic. As they worked, Jack glanced at Emily, who was now focused on spreading peanut butter across a slice of bread. "We'll figure this out," he said. Emily met his gaze, her eyes still watery but steadier than before. "Yeah," she said softly. "We will." The quiet sound of laughter drifted in from the living room as Luke and Lily played. The world outside was still blanketed in snow, but inside, the warmth of something new, something fragile but strong, had begun to take shape. They weren't just strangers brought together by chance. They were becoming something more. They were becoming a family. The snow outside glistened beneath the pale afternoon sun. The house had settled into a calm hum of quiet noises. Lily's soft babbling, the scrape of Luke's toy blocks on the hardwood floor, and the occasional crackle of the fire. Jack set 2 mugs of hot cocoa on the coffee table and sat down in the armchair across from Emily. She had curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her knees, the same worn copy of The Secret Garden resting in her lap. She had been quiet since lunch, thoughtful, distant. Jack knew she needed time to process everything, but the silence between them felt different now. It wasn't the cold silence of distrust, it was the fragile quiet of rebuilding. "You've read that book 3 times since you got here," Jack said lightly, trying to draw her back to the present. Emily smiled faintly, though her gaze remained on the cover. "It was my mom's favorite. She said it reminded her that no matter how bad things got, there was always something waiting to bloom." Jack's chest tightened. She was right. Emily finally looked up, her eyes steady but tired. "What was she like before everything?" Jack leaned back, running a hand over his face. The question brought a rush of memories, some joyful, some bittersweet. She was strong, stubborn too. Once she set her mind on something, there was no changing it. He chuckled softly. She had this laugh, loud and unashamed. It made you feel like the world wasn't so heavy. Emily's lips quirked into a soft smile. "She always said I was stubborn like her." Jack nodded. She wasn't wrong. His tone was warm, teasing. Emily hugged the blanket closer. "Why didn't it work out between you two?" Jack hesitated, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. "My mother," he admitted finally. "She didn't want me with someone who didn't fit her idea of what my life should be. Hope was kind, but she wasn't wealthy or respectable enough in my mother's eyes." Emily frowned. "That's awful." Jack's jaw tightened. "It was, but I was young and stupid. I let my mother push us apart. I thought Hope left because she gave up on me. I didn't know the truth that she was forced to leave." Emily's voice wavered. "She never told me any of that. She always made it seem like it was just us against the world." Jack leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "She did that to protect you. She didn't want you to carry the weight of what happened." His voice softened. "She wanted you to feel strong, not broken." Emily wiped at her eyes, but a tear slipped down her cheek. "She was strong," she whispered. "Even when she was sick, she never stopped fighting. She made me promise I would take care of Luke and Lily no matter what." Her voice broke. "I tried, but I wasn't enough." Jack's heart clenched. "You were more than enough," he said firmly. "You kept them safe when no one else could. You did everything right." Emily let out a shaky breath, her defenses crumbling. "It was so hard," she whispered. "Every day, I felt like I was failing them." Jack moved to the couch and sat beside her, careful not to crowd her. "You didn't fail," he said quietly. "You did what you had to. And now, you don't have to do it alone anymore." Emily turned to him, her face full of raw emotion. "But what if I can't trust this? What if you change your mind, or you leave?" Jack's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He met her gaze steadily. "I won't leave," he said. "I lost hope once. I won't lose you, too." Emily's lip trembled, but she nodded slowly. "I want to believe you." "Then let me prove it," Jack said softly. "One step at a time." They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them. Jack knew that words alone wouldn't heal what Emily had been through. Trust was built through actions, not promises. After a moment, Emily straightened, wiping her eyes. "What's the next step?" Jack smiled gently. "Well, I was thinking, you mentioned you used to love baking. How do you feel about trying again?" Emily's eyes widened. "Baking?" Jack shrugged. "Why not? We've got flour, sugar, chocolate chips, everything you need to make cookies. Unless you're afraid of the oven?" Emily laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that caught her by surprise. "I'm not afraid of the oven," she said with a grin. "Good," Jack said, standing and offering his hand. "Let's make a mess of the kitchen." Emily hesitated for half a second before taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. The kitchen soon filled with the sound of clinking bowls and laughter. Jack mixed the dry ingredients while Emily cracked the eggs, her focus intense. "I'm pretty sure the eggshells aren't part of the recipe," Jack teased. Emily rolled her eyes and fished out a small piece of shell. "You're one to talk. Your flour-to-bowl ratio is a disaster." Jack grinned. "It's a process." By the time the dough was ready, they were both dusted with flour, but the tension from earlier had melted away. The cookies baked in the oven, their sweet, warm scent filling the room. As they waited, Emily leaned against the counter, watching Jack wipe down the flour-covered countertop. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked softly. Jack paused and met her gaze. "Because you deserve to know what it feels like to be cared for." Emily's eyes shimmered again, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from something softer, something that felt a lot like trust. When the cookies came out of the oven, Emily handed a small one to Luke, who clapped his hands in excitement. Lily nibbled on hers, her chubby cheeks smeared with chocolate. Emily sat back, watching the twins with a quiet smile. Jack slid into the chair next to her and nudged her arm lightly. "You did good, Emily." Emily turned to him, her smile widening. "We did good," she corrected. Jack chuckled and nodded. "Yeah, we did." As the warmth of the cookies and the sound of the twins' giggles filled the room, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. The walls she had built around herself weren't gone yet, but they were starting to crack, and in their place, something stronger was beginning to grow. "You're really staying," she said quietly, as if needing to hear it again. Jack met her gaze, unwavering. "For as long as you need me," he said. Emily exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone anymore. The snow had stopped falling by morning, leaving the world outside glittering under the pale winter sun. The mansion, once filled with silence and shadows, was now alive with quiet hums of movement and soft laughter. Jack stood at the kitchen counter, carefully pouring coffee into a mug. The adoption papers sat neatly stacked beside him, official, final. Jack stared at the papers for a long moment, letting their weight settle in his mind. The lawyer had called early that morning. It was done. Emily, Luke, and Lily were officially his family now. A small, cautious voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Is that—" Jack turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her eyes wide as she noticed the papers on the counter. She had Luke balanced on one hip, while Lily toddled toward Jack with unsteady but determined steps. Jack gave a small nod. "It's official," he said softly. Emily took a slow step forward, her breath catching. "You mean, we're really—" Jack smiled. "We're a family." Emily's lips trembled, and for a moment she just stood there, holding Luke a little tighter. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Jack replied, his voice warm but steady. "This is where you belong." Emily blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears threatening to fall. "Nobody's ever fought for me like this," she murmured. Jack stepped forward and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're worth fighting for." Emily closed her eyes briefly, letting the truth of his words sink in. Then she looked down at Luke and smiled. "Did you hear that? We have a home." Luke giggled and reached for Jack, who took him without hesitation, balancing the boy easily in his arms. Lily tugged on Emily's sweater, babbling insistently, until Emily scooped her up and kissed her cheek. By midday, the house felt warm, in a way that wasn't just from the crackling fireplace. Jack and Emily decorated a small Christmas tree Jack had pulled from storage, a simple but meaningful gesture. Luke and Lily squealed as they watched the twinkling lights blink on for the first time. Jack handed each of them a soft, felt ornament to hang. "You're really embracing this whole family thing," Emily teased as she hung a silver star near the top of the tree. Jack shrugged, smiling. "I figured it was time." Emily stepped back, tilting her head as she admired their work. The tree was slightly uneven, the ornaments mismatched, but it was perfect in its imperfection. Lily reached for Jack's hand, babbling excitedly as she toddled toward the couch. Jack followed, scooping her up and settling her on his lap. Luke climbed up beside him, contentedly resting against his side. Emily watched them, her heart full. She curled up in the armchair with a soft blanket and let the peaceful scene wash over her. "It doesn't feel real," she murmured. Jack looked over at her. "It's real," he said. "You're here. We're here. That's real." Emily smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep inside, the kind that felt like sunlight breaking through after a long storm. That evening, the house was filled with the smell of hot cocoa and fresh cookies. The adoption certificate sat framed on the mantel, a quiet reminder of everything they had overcome. Emily glanced at it as she sipped her tea, her heart swelling with something she hadn't dared to feel in years: peace. She turned to Jack, who was sitting across from her, flipping through an old photo album he had pulled from the bookshelf. He stopped at a picture of Hope, young, radiant, standing in a garden of wildflowers. Emily leaned forward, her eyes softening as she studied her mother's familiar face. "She'd be happy, wouldn't she?" Jack's expression grew tender. "More than happy. She'd be proud. Of you. Of them." He nodded toward the twins, who had fallen asleep on the couch under a blanket. Emily brushed a tear from her cheek. "I hope so." Jack reached across the table and took her hand in his. "I know so." For a while they sat in silence, the fire crackling softly in the background. The snow outside had started to fall again, light, delicate flakes that settled over the garden like a whispered promise of something new. Emily shifted in her chair, curling her legs beneath her. "Jack, what happens now?" Jack chuckled. Now, we live. We make pancakes on Saturday mornings. We celebrate birthdays. We build blanket forts and learn new things together, one step at a time." Emily laughed softly, nodding. "I like the sound of that." Jack's smile widened. "Me too." As night settled over the mansion, Jack and Emily tucked the twins into their shared crib, adjusting their blankets and pressing soft kisses to their foreheads. Luke stirred briefly, but Lily slept peacefully, her tiny hand wrapped around a corner of her blanket. Jack stepped back, his arms crossed as he watched them sleep. Emily stood beside him, her gaze lingering on their small, peaceful faces. "You gave us a home," Emily whispered. Jack turned to her, his voice gentle but certain. "You gave me a family," Emily exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. For so long she had braced herself for the worst, but now she felt safe. She felt free. They left the nursery quietly, closing the door behind them. As they walked down the hall, Jack paused by the large window overlooking the garden. Emily stopped beside him, and they both stared out at the snow-covered world beyond. The garden, once barren and cold, was now blanketed in soft white, glistening in the moonlight. Emily rested her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Jack nodded. It is. Emily turned to him, her eyes bright with something that looked an awful lot like hope. Thank you, Jack, for everything. Jack smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to thank me, he said. You belong here. Emily's smile grew as she turned back to the window, her heart full. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to look forward to. And as the snow continued to fall, the house that had once felt empty was now filled with warmth, laughter, and love, a place where new memories would be made, and old wounds could finally heal. This was home. As the snow continued to fall softly outside, Emily and Jack stood side by side, their hearts no longer weighed down by fear or loss. The once empty mansion was now a home filled with warmth, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. It was proof that even after the hardest battles, there is always a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to find where you truly belong. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of kindness, resilience, and family, please consider subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss another story of courage, second chances, and the unbreakable bonds that bring people together. Your support helps us continue to share stories that inspire and uplift. Thank you for watching, and remember, no matter how lost you feel, there is always a place where you belong. Click subscribe now and join us for more heartwarming stories. We'll see you in the next one.